Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am Luke, and I'm here today with Colin Wilson, who is the author of Luath Scots Language Learner. I'm really happy that we get to talk today about the Scots language.
Thank you.
Fydelig Colin.
Och, I'm doing all right. It's Guy Colin Wheat here in Aberdeen. We're not in the middle of the winter yet, but temperature's down. It's cold and it's wheat, and it has been for about a week now. So we're just doing what we can, and I've hardly been out the door most of the time. But
I
like
can
are you?
imagine.
But like are you?
Rare. I'm doing great. My ability to produce Scots is limited at the moment because all of the study I've done of the Scots language has been with your wonderful book. The link, by the way, is in the description for Amazon if anybody wants to take a look at it, especially the audio CD as well. I'd recommend. And yes, and so I can understand, of course, when you speak, Colin. And one of the things we'll talk about too is that very issue. Of course, in addition to speaking Scots fluently, you speak standard Scottish English naturally. So we have to talk about all these things. First, let's talk about what languages are in Scotland.
The languages that are usually considered to be indigenous to Scotland are, the historic languages, which are the one that has been here the longest is Scottish Gaelic or Gaelic. The next to arrive, Germanic varieties arrived in Scotland not all that much later. When I say not all that much later, I mean the 6th or 7th century as opposed to the 5th. We had North Germanic varieties in the north of the country. We had West Germanic varieties arriving from mainland Europe. And these have come down to us today. The West Germanic varieties have come down to us as Scots. The Northern Germanic varieties are extinct in Scotland, unfortunately. And the majority language in Scotland today is a form of English, which has arrived here since the beginning of our involvement in the current United Kingdom. I hope I've answered the question.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and it's important to recognize that, of course, Scots is not only a language in its own right, and has been for some time. That is, it's not a variant of, say, the standard English that is spoken either in England or in the United States. Like I speak standard English, right? It's not something that came from that. Rather, they have a common origin, mostly Middle English, but I think also a good deal from Old English as well, right?
Yes, I think although I am not a linguistic historian by any means, but the origins go back to the fact that modern English as we know it was originated in varieties of Anglo-Saxon of Old English that were spoken more in the south of Britain, whereas Scots is descended more from more northern varieties from the Angles who arrived in northern England and who populated Northumbria and southern Scotland. And of course, to that we can add that for a time before Scotland became part of the United Kingdom, Scots went through a period of being the spoken and written language of state here in Scotland.
Right. Oh, and for those of us who may not be that familiar with the Union and when that happened, and James and all that, that's something that's probably worth discussing. When did Scotland become part of the UK? That is the creation of the UK, and then, of course, what happened to the Scots language after that?
The United Kingdom was officially created in the year 1707, but its origins go back to about a century before that, when Queen Elizabeth of England, the first Queen Elizabeth of England, died without leaving any heir to the throne, and the English nobility offered the throne of England to King James VI, who was already King of Scotland. So at that time we had two kingdoms with the same monarch reigning over them, and after 100 years the two kingdoms were formally united by the Treaty of Union of Scotland and England, and that was the foundation of the United Kingdom as it exists today.
Yeah. And then, if I recall from reading in the introduction of your
Mm.
book, what happened then is that we'll call it the variety of Middle English, which had descended to become Scots, I think was already called Scots at that time. Is that not right? Or was it,
Yeah, yes,
because it was called
it was.
Ingles for a few centuries, even in Scotland, though it already had diverged.
Yes, that's right. And
Mm,
during most of its period as the language of state,
mm,
it was called, well, Scots. I believe it was spelt differently. It was spelt Scotttis. The I
mm,
may have been elided in speech. I don't actually know. I wasn't there at the time, but
mm.
uh, Scottis
Yeah.
or Scots was how it was known during
Mm.
most of that period.
And people would learn the language before they'd come to the court in Scotland, wouldn't they? I think from Norway and from other countries, for example, France as well.
Yes, there are people who have more expertise in Scotland's linguistic history than I have. But yes, certainly I've heard if you speak to someone such as Stephen Murdoch, who's studied these things quite extensively and researched, he will confirm that when foreign ambassadors and so on, when foreign dignitaries came to Scotland, they would learn and they would use Scots.
Which only makes sense. It's the
Oh
language of
yes.
the land, and the language of the country, like you said, for most of its
Mm,
most of its history. So, well,
mm,
then what happened? What is the because if I'm sure there's many people watching this who maybe
mm,
they've heard of it or they don't know what it is. We got to hear at the beginning an example, which was great to hear you speaking Scots,
mm,
because for those of us who have had some exposure to the Scots language, or it may be even the Scottish accent in media or something,
mm,
maybe we can pick up something. But I think for a lot of people out there, many of whom are not native speakers actually of English, who are
mm,
watching us today, they're probably like, "I didn't understand anything," which is great to show that this is indeed a
mm.
different language. But yeah, so what is the status of Scots today?
The status really is that in practice it doesn't have any. And although there was some political movement about 20 years ago, the UK government ratified something called the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages. Uh,
Mm,
and in ratifying that charter, it committed either the UK government or the Scottish government, which has devolved responsibility in that area,
mm,
to make moves towards supporting and promoting the use of Scots.
mm,
In practice, very little has actually happened. There's more Scots being used in schools. The Scottish government supports financially uh, an organisation called the Scots Language Centre, but we don't really at the moment have, for example, Scots being taught in schools, in most
mm,
schools anyway, as a specific subject. We don't have any use of Scots in the state broadcasting organisation, the BBC, not even
mm,
in its Scottish section, BBC Scotland.
mm.
So really, the current status of Scots is next to nothing.
Why would, for example, BBC Scotland not have an interest in pursuing this? Because they do have Gaelic, don't they?
They do. Of course, I can only speculate as to the BBC's motives. You'd really need to ask them for a definitive answer. But if you invited me to speculate, I can think of two reasons. One of them is political, and one of them is social. Politically, for rightly or wrongly, Scots has seen to become associated with the movement for secession from the UK, and the BBC is that isn't really what they're about. Ostensibly, they're meant to be neutral, but in practice, that isn't always the case. And the other reason is social, for better or for worse. And I think it's very unfortunate. It shouldn't have come about, but for better or for worse, Scots has seen to become language in Scotland has become associated with social class
Hmm.
to a greater extent than exists elsewhere. Uh, it,
Yeah, you
it
mentioned in the book too how
mm,
once corporal punishment was outlawed in the UK in 1980, that was essentially when Scottish children in schools, if they spoke Scots, were no
mm.
longer physically hurt for saying, "I dinna ken" or something.
Yes, well,
Because
that's what
yeah,
happened. That I actually know the individual that happened to, but
really?
yeah, yeah,
"1977,
he
huh?"
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was abolished by law, and then corporal punishment was abolished by law in the 1980s. Although I think policy varied from region to region. When I was at school in Aberdeenshire in the 1960s, the 1970s, I don't remember anyone being having corporal punishment for saying anything in Scots.
Mm,
It wasn't tolerated. It would always, if you said something, you would get a verbal rebuke, but
mm,
you wouldn't receive corporal punishment. Whereas uh, I used to know someone. She died a few years ago who was quite a bit older than me. She'd been at school in Aberdeenshire in the 1940s, and it happened. It did happen in those days. But by the time I was at school in the same area in the 1960s, uh, it didn't happen anymore, although
mm.
clearly it did happen in other places.
Yeah, yeah, I
Mm,
know, that similar things happened, like in my video where I talked about, this
mm,
question of dialect versus language, how,
mm,
Italy experienced certain things as well with the various regional languages also not being tolerated in school for these various reasons. It's interesting too, and
mm,
you and I are, we're polyglots, we love languages,
mm.
and to us, I don't think it occurs to us that there should be any harm in being bilingual. I didn't grow up
No,
bilingual, and I,
no.
would think it would be great to
Mm.
be truly bilingual, even in closely related languages. Do you think that, there's any legitimacy in the idea that, we want our Scottish children to learn to speak standard English so they do better in life, or could they perfectly learn standard? I'm kind of biased in my opinion, obviously, but I'm thinking, is this true that they could perfectly learn standard Scottish English, or whatever right of English is being taught there, and be fluent in Scots? I don't know. Is there not
Uh,
enough time for that in school? What do you think?
well, I don't know. For a long time, Scottish children, if they came to school speaking Scottish Gaelic, they received their education in international English, the Scottish version of it, Scottish Standard English.
Yeah, SSE,
The
right?
SSE, yes, but they continued to use their own vernacular in their own community, and
Mm.
on the whole, they were able to master both. And now, in the last 30 or 40 years, we've seen increasing use of some pupils even receive their entire education through the medium of that language.
Mm.
It doesn't seem to have disrupted their fluency in English. Pupils still emerge from school at the end of their education, and they're able to use international English perfectly adequately.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, I know people younger than me who are,
mm, yeah,
so incredibly preternaturally good at speaking English that they sound like they're practically native. Said they're from Romania or Italy or,
mm,
Brazil, and it's crazy. It's just like, wow. So and clearly they do fine as
yeah,
well
yeah,
using English in their international, realms or in business or whatever they need it for. So I think it's quite evident that, um, there can be bilingual education,
yeah.
and, I don't think anybody is advocating the removal of English from the schools in Scotland. That would probably be
Oh
too
no,
far.
no, no, that I think that would be a bad idea. It's the most widely used international language, and pupils need to be able to use international
Mm,
English. Uh, I
right.
think it isn't actually clear whether moves to eradicate Scots were done purely as part of whether it was done for purely for may have been the case, or there may have been more sinister motives than that. I don't actually know.
Mm,
Uh,
yeah.
but it may, being charitable, we can say it was probably done for misguided pedagogical reasons.
That
rather
is
than political. That's a charitable
that is a
interpretation.
nice charitable explanation. Yeah, I think that's something, because I think in
Mm,
Italy too, and I know we have some viewers today, from
mm,
Italy who experienced that. For example,
yeah.
a fellow, YouTuber, Davide Giamello, he has the,
Mm,
channel, Podcast Italiano. He talked about this too, and I've talked with him
mm,
directly. What do you
mhm,
do in Italy? It's harder there because it's not like there's one non-standard, language in addition to standard Italian. There are many of them.
mm.
So, what do you do? Does it take too much time away from the curriculum? How much interest is there? Um, and those are all interesting and important questions to discuss. But part of it too is, what does one do about the standardization of a language which has no single written or spoken standard? What do you think about that with Scots?
I don't think we need a spoken standard, and in fact, I think if that was ever um, suggested, or if anyone ever tried to implement that, I think it would meet a great deal of resistance,
Hmm.
and rightly, in my view.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I do think it would be beneficial to have a generic written Scots that could be used to represent any spoken variety. That
Mm.
meets some resistance as well.
Mm.
Um, I'm not even sure that it's it's really workable. It would have to be developed and tried, and it may well be that there wouldn't be a generic written Scots that would be capable of representing any variety. In which case, we would have to accept that the historic Scots language has evolved and diverged into several modern regional languages.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that's a hypothesis, a
Mm.
hypothetical situation. I would like to think that it would be possible to develop a generic written Scots that could represent any spoken variety, but it would need a bit of acceptance. It would need, for example, if people from the Northeast want to write the Scots as they know it, they will tend to write, for example, a word such as fit or far, and they will tend to write it with an F.
Hmm.
Uh, whereas literary Scots doesn't have that. It's always written with a WH. So people might look at that and say, whit and whar.
I'll write those here so people can look at them in
Yeah.
the chat. Here they are, and let me know if I've spelled them, right or
Yeah,
not.
yeah,
But yeah,
that's
yeah.
right. Yep, that's right.
Oh, good. Well, that's and hey, I learned from your standardized
Yeah,
spelling you used in your
yeah,
book, and that's not too bad.
yeah.
Because WH initially in the Northeast, where it's called the Doric,
Hmm.
WH is makes an F sound, and it's very consistent even with, Phillies, all
Phillies.
those
Yeah, yeah,
words that it's that simple, and
yeah,
that's nice because and that's one reason, of course, English spelling, standard English spelling hasn't been it's hard to standardize because if you make it entirely phonetic, then you'd have to choose one, variety of accent, whether it's RP
yeah.
or General American or whatever. It
Mm,
it
yeah,
wouldn't work for everyone
mhm,
necessarily. But if
yeah,
you keep something old-fashioned like a WH and it's fit
yeah.
in that place, is it pronounced, "whit" in, Gleska, or how is
Uh,
it?
well, of course, another phenomenon going there, which is also going on in English, which that is that the distinction between the voiced and the voiceless W is being lost. So
Right.
in Glasgow, you're actually quite likely to hear wet
Okay.
as opposed to whet, because, as I say, that distinction is being lost.
Interesting. Yeah, I
Mm,
had, I'd been
mm,
aware that Northern England and,
mm,
Scottish varieties of English that I've heard often retain the hua. That's what I've heard in
yeah.
people I've heard, but, and of course, in most American, accents as well, it's gone, though if you go out west, you can hear people saying "what" and "when," and I've,
Mm.
acquired it as an affectation because I like it.
Good for you. Good for you.
Yeah, it's old-fashioned. Obviously, I like old-fashioned,
Yeah.
language things, so,
Yeah.
not surprisingly, I'd, pick that up. But yeah, those are important. By the way, anyone out there who wants to ask a question
Mm,
of a speaker of Scots, who obviously Colin here, or wants to
mm.
ask about it or how to learn it, we'll be addressing a lot of those questions today, but, feel free to be, interacting with us.
I'll be
Um,
interested.
I would be interested to hear too. Yeah, because I can see we have people here who are, from Brazil and from Italy and from other places. So, welcome everyone, by the way. Thanks for joining us. So, yeah, one of the biggest things for me is, I mean, I'm a polyglot and I like
Mm,
languages in general. And to me, it's not just like something I would dabble in. It's
mm,
something I would really want to know well. I certainly would love to learn, the basics, which I feel I've gotten to learn
mm,
basics of Scots so far, thanks to your book. But and I want that to be known too, especially to the Scottish people, seeing me, that people who would want to learn Scots aren't, because of all the stigma that's been attached to
mm.
the language through the centuries. I'm sure it's
Yes.
strange for a non-Scottish person to want to pick up the language. For me, though, there could be nothing more natural, because if I go to a country and I don't speak the language, like when I got stationed in Japan, I didn't know any Japanese, or I knew very little.
Mm,
So I made it my mission to learn Japanese to fluency as quickly as I possibly could, just because it made sense
mhm,
to me. And maybe not everybody's like that, but um, and of course, one doesn't require to really learn the Scots because everybody speaks English. But what's interesting
mm.
is, thanks to the preponderance of the learning of English as a second language almost everywhere, you really don't need to learn any language except
No,
English to get around. Which,
no.
except of course you've been to France, and I love France, and I'm sure
Mm,
you've had plenty of experiences where the French, even if they do know English well, would probably, for cultural reasons, try to refuse to speak English. But as a French speaker yourself, you may not have encountered that so much. I haven't either.
mm,
But the idea that, so I think that's sort of where it comes to me. Like, I don't have to learn as a native English speaker other languages, but I want to, because it attaches me more to the people, to the culture, to the literature, all these things that make up the richness of my own life personally. That is my connection to, whether it's ancient languages like Latin and Greek, modern languages like Italian and Portuguese and Russian. I mean, they just make up um, who I am. And so anytime I get the chance to explore the amazing and usually infinite detail that's in a culture and a language, then it's in this exciting experience. So I think there's a lot of polyglots out
yeah.
there who are seeing this now, who will want to learn Scots, but how do we do it? How do we do
Oh,
it? So,
mm.
Luath Scots, your book is a wonderful
Well,
first step.
thank you very
What
much.
about,
Thank you very
yeah? What
much.
about that?
Mm.
What about after that, or in addition to it? Oh, you muted yourself. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So I just needed to clear my throat, and I didn't want to do it down the
you're a
microphone. So
professional.
I do my best. I do my best. Where would you go after it? I think you can buy recorded material in Scots. There's probably more on the web. Like if you hunt on,
Mm.
like maybe some of the things I put on YouTube, although they're not, they're in a mixture. Some of it in Scots, some of it not.
Yes.
Yeah.
Everyone, please subscribe to Colin's YouTube channel. The link's in the description, or if it's not, then I'm horribly remiss, and I'll put it here
Thank you very much.
yeah, because you're putting out these great videos. A lot of them recently about the
Mm.
Scots language, and you have at least one where you're speaking in it. And I think once you get more subscribers and people commenting on your videos, you might be like, "Oh, I kind of like doing this." Then you make more videos for us, which would be great.
Yeah. Now, I just thought that although he passed away a few years ago, but there was a man, Dr. George Philp, who had a very big private archive of recordings in Scots.
Mm,
He'd recorded various people, and he used to sell them to interested parties. You could buy cassettes that he'd recorded. It was just a small business that he ran, cassettes of recordings in Scots. Dr. George Philp. I think the company that he sold them through was his own company called Scotsoon. I don't know what's happened to Scotsoon since George Philp died. That's maybe worth looking into. Now, if I'd thought better, I could have researched that before we came on the web. But that's a possible pointer anyway. There's also an organisation called the Scots Language Centre.
mm,
They have a website which has links to various recordings in Scots.
mm.
That's another thing you could maybe search for on Google. They've got recorded material in Scots.
Yeah.
Um,
I
so
have that
so
open here. Let's see if I can. I'll share
yeah,
it here
yeah.
for us on the screen so people can have a look at it while we keep
Mm.
talking. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, there are a few things. The amount of material out there isn't vast, but it isn't non-existent.
Yeah, which is great about I mean, that's how I learned that, the language, exists at all. I mean,
Mm,
I mean, how shameful is that for someone with a college education from another English-speaking country, to simply not to know that, that the language, its history, the fact that it's clear. I mean, here's an example. In fact, I will. This is with Mars. Of course, Mars is a planet I like a lot, which people know. And this, I really like this at the scotslanguage.com, as there are a lot of articles, and here's one about the Aurori, the solar system, and or which, for example, let's see if I can read it, and if you
mm,
don't mind, let's see if I please correct anything you want in my pronunciation for you, all you Scottish people out there. I apologize in advance for the mistakes I'm sure I will make. But so, Mers. The Greeks cried this planet after Ares, their god of war. Is it what's the O sound like here? God,
it's a schwa, the god aware.
god of war, god of war.
Although there we have difference in dialect already. In
Mm.
my tongue, I would say the god awar, but they
Oh,
say
really?
the god aware.
Where?
But
So,
but
what
the O is
dialect is this? Do you think?
yeah, the O is pronounced just as a schwa.
Okay. And so this isn't the Doric, obviously. I noticed, for example, or instead of wor, and the WUR, wor for hour.
Mm.
That's Doric, right?
Mhm. Oor, yes. Well, okay. On Meer naar only other planet and Oor Sungard. Now, that Oor is emphatic. He's saying
Oh, okay.
our solar system as opposed to our solar system.
Oh, okay. So this
Uh,
speaker probably would use wor if it were unemphatic.
Unemphatic. Yes, yes.
Okay.
And I can only take it that Sungard is a historic astronomical term that maybe Scots-speaking astronomers used 200 or 300 years ago. I haven't heard of it before.
Hmm.
I think nowadays that would be just a solar system or solar system.
Hmm. Right.
Uh-huh,
Right, exactly. And that's, of
uh-huh,
course, something that I have difficulty with too, because I definitely know the
mm,
phrases that I've committed to memory from your book,
mhm,
but I feel if I tried to speak Scots, so much English would
mhm,
interfere that
mhm,
I'd be terrified of embarrassing myself, which is funny because I normally don't feel that when I learn a language because,
mm,
um people would be usually very charitable to me. Like if
yeah.
I know I have at least one Brazilian friend here with whom I've spoken Portuguese with, and who has tolerated my Spanishisms because I know Spanish better.
Mm,
And but it's just cute. It's not so bad. But I feel like a language like this, which requires I think it requires a lot of respect from me,
mm,
certainly at this point, which is why I want to keep learning Scots and promoting the
mm,
learning of Scots. But I'm going to definitely need your help, Colin, like you're helping me today, having the chat, and help from other Scottish people. And I think part
mm,
of so that's sort of one of my significant motivations is to do this is to encourage speakers of Scots to make more content because this content is great, and this I can read this pretty well.
mm,
I can understand a lot of it, especially having used your book. I get into certain places where, like Sungir, that means I see garden. I think of that's I can see an etymological root which looks like a would make sense for solar system, but there are other words here like
uh-huh. You know what it is to gird something.
right.
It's to put something round something. You gird something with something else,
There you
and
go.
so in that sense that the planets gird the sun, but that's a use of the word gird I haven't seen before.
Beautiful. That's
Mm,
great. If and yeah, and if it is, a little unusual, still it's really cool, and it shows what the value is of
mm,
the language, as both of course, as a spoken vernacular, and the value of learning it to be able to connect with, Scots speakers who are willing to talk
mm,
with foreigners, in
mhm,
their native language. But in addition to that, let's see, there was one. I remember seeing one word here where I really didn't know what it was. Yeah, I'm not sure of this. So, this is a word, a sindri ken speckles. I don't know what kenspeckles are. Known something.
Well, Sindri ken speckle, but ken speckle is even a word that's used occasionally in Scottish English. It's
Mhm.
something that stands out. I suppose it's related to conspicuous. It's something
Mm.
conspicuous.
It's
So
cool.
this is a world, a sundry ken speckles that would take a breath away.
Yeah, that would take your breath away.
Yeah,
So that's what I wanted to point out because I wanted to talk about extensive reading
yeah.
a bit today, and I really, really like these. And now that I've read your book, I can do better with this. But
Mm, mm,
let me stop sharing for a second. So
mm,
there's some terminology which I've known about, but I understood in detail a bit better
mm,
recently. That's called
mm,
extensive reading, and those of us, many of us. Who are many, of course, followers of my channel, know this book, which is Lingua Latina Familia Romana. So it's the
mhm,
teaching Latin from the very beginning, and it starts so wonderfully simply as a map of the Roman Empire, and then it
mm,
says these simple sentences, which you'll immediately understand: Roma in Italia est.
mhm,
Italia in Europa est. And it starts with that, and then in 300 pages, it gets to advanced literature like poetry, or relatively advanced for the initial level. And it does it because it's a graded reader. And it happens to all be in Latin, and it's very, very well constructed. It took decades to do, by this author. It's very, very well constructed, and that's extensive reading. Extensive where you have 98 to 100% comprehension. So this is extensive reading. Now, I actually used to misunderstand this term, and perhaps it's used differently, but the idea that extensive, to me, it sounds like, and I think the point is that you're reading a lot of it. That's why it's extensive, but it's also at a high level of comprehension. And 90 to 98 is intensive reading, where you have to work. And then below 90% is called reading pain.
yeah, yeah,
And I don't
yeah.
have reading pain when I read something like the article we were just looking at. I think it's more like
Oh, good.
definitely more intensive.
Mm,
And when I read the dialogues in your book and Luath Scots, it's definitely much more comprehensible input. It's definitely more extensive reading because I can understand a lot, and you have, of course, the new vocabulary. But I was wondering about something else, and this is a suggestion to you, and you have the time if you want to write such books, or
mm,
to other people out there, Scots speakers. Here's a reader, for example, that's bilingual, Portuguese and English, and
mm,
so it'll have really simple sentences in it in the beginning, but then it gets more advanced. It's graded. It gets more difficult as you go along, and it constantly reuses vocabulary. So you get an introduction, and you get more and more of the same things to keep that close to 98% level. But since it's bilingual, you can always glance over at, in this case, the English to get a handle of what's going on. So, for example, você pode ajudar-me, por favor? And it has over the English, can you help me, please? And as much as you need the English, you can jump over. So I was thinking that might be also a useful thing for Scots speakers to
mhm,
writing dialogues. And I think the temptation not to is the desire to keep everything as pure in Scots as possible. And I respect that a lot because I like doing that in Latin.
mm.
Um,
It
but
it isn't
go ahead. What do you think?
unknown. Yeah, it isn't unknown to see written Scots with glossaries at the foot. That wouldn't be anything
Mhm.
new.
That would
But
be
to
neat.
actually have a complete parallel translation, that would be a new step.
That would be helpful to see the
Mm,
direct idiom because
mm,
I think that's a little bit where some of my hesitation comes from because
mm,
of the similarity with Standard English. Um, it whether it's Standard Scottish English or Standard
mm.
American English that I speak, obviously, it kind of gives you it makes me feel like I understand more than I do, and I do
Ah,
get it, but I don't have this like with Portuguese, since those words are the spelling and the pronunciation, like "pode" doesn't sound like "can." It doesn't look like "can," but I know that "pode" means "can," so I can just say it. But if I'm trying to say words that are rather similarly spelled to English, but pronounced in a specific different way,
mm,
that kind of thing, that's what I would love to see a lot of content,
yep,
written
yep. Mm.
and auditory, so, yeah. Yeah. Well, sorry I kind of derailed the conversation with the extensive reading part, but that's something
All right,
I'd
no.
love to do, love to see
Mm,
see more
yeah.
of, and strongly encourage you and anyone else with a YouTube channel who knows Scots to make more content. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about comprehensible input. You said you hadn't heard much about that before.
Well, I don't know if I quite said that, but I hadn't heard much about it for a very long time. I remember hearing the term being used in something I was watching on the TV, really in about 1982 or 1983. But I think that one of the participants in the program might even have been the person who originally devised the term. You gave his name, and it sounded German. I think,
Passion.
yeah,
Yeah.
he
American.
was he
Yeah.
German?
No, I've heard him speak, and he had an American accent, so I'm pretty sure he's American. Uh,
No,
now I question it. Now I doubt everything, but yeah,
no,
Stephen Krashen.
no. Okay, the thing is, I remember he was giving examples of comprehensible input, and I think something he said was "Das ist meine Hand," and the examples he was giving were in German, so that it was a German sounding name. So that made me think, was it actually the same person who originated the term? But I remember he explained the idea and what it was, and I remember thinking that thinking at the time, yes, it seemed like a good idea.
Yeah, that's I would love to see that where
Mm,
and all kind of I mean, we don't really need if so many people in the world speak English, which we do natively and
mm,
non-natively, we don't necessarily need the kind of thing like I just showed you, which is Roma in Italia est. Rome is in Italy because it's those words are so different, they sound so different that
mm,
it can help. At the same time, though, it would be nice to see a really complete course, whether video courses like I do in Latin and Ancient Greek on my other channel, Scorpio
mm,
Martianus, where I actually, really totally comprehensible, where you don't even need subtitles, though you get them sometimes to really see it in action. And there are a couple videos I saw on the scotslanguage.com where there's a school teacher teaching young children. I'm trying to remember some of the expressions now. That's part of the problem. I can remember exactly what you do. She's like, raise your hands and put down,
mm,
and show me your hand. Like I remember your hand. I remember the pronunciation more or less,
mm,
but that's getting a lot of that and having that kind of repetition would help to distinguish the English that I have natively, and true Scots language. So I'd love to see some of that. So if you ever feel like just taking your phone, you don't even have to point it at yourself. Just point it at stuff in front of you and say what's in the kitchen, stuff like
mm.
that. Would you think you might do that possibly?
Well, I wouldn't rule it out, although yes, yeah, I wouldn't rule it out, but uh, maybe other people could, I've made one video in Scots, so maybe someone else could do something like that.
It was fabulous. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
well,
your
thank you.
the tour of Toulouse. And here we see our friend Rafael Torrigiano, Paloglass's YouTube channel, which you also should all subscribe to.
Hmm.
He actually has lived in Edinburgh for a while, where he's going to university, and he says, being able to listen to a native speaker just chat freely about whatever is
Mm,
also a great kind of input, and it because um,
mm,
of the related origin of English and Scots that can be great. So where you're just talking and narrating your tour, we can really quickly pick up the new vocabulary without a lot of effort. It is highly comprehensible just hearing
mm,
a native Scots speaker talk, especially if it's a little bit slower, but even faster. Like the dialogues, like hearing the dialogues in the book, which are wonderful. In your book, they at first the first time I listened through them, it's like yeah, I got 70% of it maybe, and then of course I read it and then I'm able from the spelling,
yeah.
I'm able to pick it up and then it starts to build these connections. But yeah, and also another person has asked for vlogs, just like your tour in Toulouse. That would definitely be
Uh,
a vlog. Yeah, really simplicity. Really what we don't have now is a lot of content. I see some others were asking some
mhm,
questions.
yeah.
Um,
Just purely out of interest, how many people are watching us here as we speak to each
89
other?
at the moment. It got up to 100, earlier,
Goodness
but,
me.
Yeah. Oh, we'll get more too in the coming days as more people see this after
Yeah.
it's published as a separate recorded video. So
Yes.
yeah, it's
Yes,
great.
I've stood up and spoken in front of gatherings of people in the past, but I don't think any of them were ever as large as 89.
Oh, then this is exciting. Well, I
It's a
assure you.
personal record. Personal record.
Well, you need to do more of it. This is fantastic. Yeah, I'm
Mm.
glad. Oh, so many people here have probably already subscribed to your channel.
Yeah.
That
Yes,
means that
I'm
they already bought
very
the book.
very appreciative that so many people have come to watch.
Yeah, and it's some other people said I don't think you can see the comments, but
No.
um, that which is okay. You'll be able to see them later after the
Mm.
recording. But someone also said they already bought your book, so I'm glad about that. And
I certainly am.
yeah, and
Yeah.
of course, and so what else did I want to talk about? So yeah, extensive reading, um, and yeah, it's what if, and we talked about this a bit earlier before the live stream. So here I am,
Hmm.
polyglot, with a bit of Scottish background in my family history, but clearly not from Scotland.
Hmm.
And then if I actually try to converse with people in Scots, let's say Aberdeen,
Yeah.
where, as you said in the book, we'd expect people to be a little bit more. It wouldn't be so strange there, right? Maybe for a foreigner, but it wouldn't be strange to hear it. And you said it even in middle class, I think, in the book.
That's right. Although I wrote that over 20 years ago,
Mm,
and it's actually surprising the extent of language. If you walk around the city centre, yes, you still hear it, but it's more common if you just walk around the city centre to hear Scottish Standard English
mm,
and foreign languages. And if you wanted to be much more certain of hearing people actually using it,
mm,
you would probably be better to get on a bus and go to, for example, my wife's hometown, which is Fraserburgh, which is
mm.
about an hour's drive from here, and where the language is still much more obviously present than it is here in Aberdeen. And that's an observation just based on the last 20 years or so since I wrote the book.
Hmm. Well, that's interesting, and I've heard that as well
Mm,
in just a country I'm more familiar with, which is Italy. That my generation and older, you can find people depending on the region who may know their regional dialect. It depends. Places like
mm,
up in the north, where, like I mentioned, Davide Gemello, he doesn't know almost any of Piemontese, of the language of Piedmont, hardly at all, very little. Whereas people in the south who speak, like in Salerno, where I lived for a little bit, they know Salernitano, even the
mm,
dialect of the Neapolitan language,
mm,
in addition to being familiar with the Neapolitan language. But generally, where you go, yeah, people younger, like I'm 36, so people
mm,
who are in their 20s now, I imagine that possibly wouldn't know Scots very well. And that's what kind of concerns me too,
mm,
because these languages, just Neapolitan and Scots, are two that come to mind as ones which have been really important centers of culture, of literature, of music, and in poetry, these books and all these things that um, it's something I don't want to be lost, because I find that really sad, certainly by the native speakers. But someone asked here. JM asked, "How different is Scots compared to English, and are Portuguese and Spanish further apart than Scots and English?" Well, I know we have some speakers of Portuguese and Spanish here um, as well, so we might be able to ask some of them too. So if you're a speaker of
mm.
Portuguese or Spanish, feel free to write your comment and we'll talk about it. But
Uh,
let's talk to you,
mm.
Colin, about this. What do you
Yeah, no, well, I think to give the correct answer to that, you would need a person who can converse equally well in all four of them. And
That's not me.
if such a person exists, I don't know who it is.
Well, maybe we'll make them. Maybe that person is here watching. I know we
Maybe we
have.
will. Maybe we will.
I know Ramona
I
was here.
yeah. I think for one thing, it depends on the regional variety.
Mm,
Uh, the dialect spoken in northeast Scotland, which is the one I know best, it's the one I use, will probably be more difficult to somebody from London, for example, than the variety you hear in Glasgow.
Well, maybe we should demonstrate if you're willing. Maybe you could talk about some things that are familiar to you, like where you're from, any of your family that you would want to talk about, things that you've done in your career. And well, actually, I want to talk about those in English as well. But I
Okay,
wanted
okay.
to. But let's just have you speak Scots for a minute or so, and I'll just listen.
Well, I'll do what I can, but it's hard just to speak about anything just off the top of your head about nothing of a. But I'll do what I can. So, for what it's worth, this is me, Colin Wilson, 62 or even 62-year-old, brought up nae far outside Aberdeen, place called Petercouter. It's about 20 minutes drive to the west of Aberdeen. I've been in different places in the UK. I've spent the 1980s in London. I spent the 1990s in Glasgow. I came back here to bide in Aberdeen in 2000. I'm married to Fiona. She's for the Broch. That's you want to see that name on the map of the Broch is called Fraserborough on the map, but in our language it's cried the Broch. And fit more you need to ken.
Wonderful.
Well,
So thanks
it's just
to
well, thank you. It's just normal language.
exactly, which is sort of the point. It's just normal
Yeah.
language. Language is just language, which um, that's worth talking about too, about the certain idealizations of language. Yeah, and so thanks to having used your book, I had 100% comprehension. There wasn't a single word that wasn't new or instantly recognizable to me, which is great. But I wonder how other people feel about that, especially if you're a non-native
yeah.
English speaker.
Yeah.
Um,
How were you with the word bidden? That's not a word you'll hear every day.
Bidden,
I've,
so like to
I
bidden
have,
means
yes,
yeah, I lived
I
in.
have dwelt, I have dwelt, I have
Yeah,
lived.
dwelt,
Yes,
bidden.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Oh, yeah, it was, well, because it's in the book, so I do
Yeah.
it. So you taught me.
Okay,
You
good.
taught me.
You've studied it in detail. I can tell.
Well, not that much, not as much as I'd want to, but, yeah.
Uh,
Well, let's see what you can teach me then, so this will be fun. So let's see if, I can construct a sentence or 2 in Scots about, myself, and this will be terrifying because I've never spoken Scots with anyone ever before, except just to the walls and so forth. So, yeah, it's so weird. I've never felt self-conscious about trying to speak another language, but,
well,
this is it's fun.
just only as much as you're comfortable with, even if that isn't very much. But have a go.
Sure.
Have a go.
So let's say maybe, I'm gonna, write some here and put the text on the screen. So, I, lived in Pennsylvania for 20 years before I moved to, Italy. So this is a nice, simple
Mhm.
sentence. And then, I misspelled Pennsylvania. No, did I get it right? No, good. I
It
got just the right
looks
number of
okay to
hands.
me. Looks
It
okay
does
to
look
me.
okay. I normally, you know what I thought was missing? The long vowel mark over the A in Pennsylvania, which is the Latin version. I, I have the delight of speaking rarely
Mm,
English. I get to speak Latin and other languages a lot more, so I'm a strange person that way. But
mm.
so, yeah, help me out here. Good. How would I render this in correct Scots?
Uh, I I bid in Pennsylvania for 20 years before I moved to Italy.
Uh, 20 year, and afore is spelled AFORE, right?
AFORE, yeah.
Uh, and then what was moved? Was it the
Well,
same?
you can say moved. There's also the word flitted, which refers to the act of physically moving home. But you mean more than that. You didn't just physically move home. You went there and you built a life there. So it's better
Right.
to say before I moved to Italy.
Okay. Actually, it was a flit. It was more flit. Temporary.
You were
I was
going to say
temporary there.
flitted, were you? Okay.
Yeah,
So
let's do that. So
okay.
was the first word "of," A
I,
apostrophe V? Like,
uh,
so I've
no,
I've wait,
before I moved, before I flitted.
Oh, the first word, so I've lived. How would I say that?
Oh,
Abid,
I've lived, or I lived, abid.
abid with so B-I-D, right?
No, that's the present tense. Bade is the past tense.
Okay, so how do I spell it?
B-A-D-E.
So
Abid.
B-A-D-E.
It's a
Okay,
strong verb.
cool. Right. All right.
Bide, bide, and bade.
How does that look?
Abade and that looks fine.
All right, great. So,
Okay, Pennsylvania for 20 year.
oh, 420 year. Yes,
Uh,
let me correct that. Uh, Fix that. So, uh, uh, Abade in Pennsylvania for 20
for
year.
20
For
year. Afore
affluent
afflicted to
uh,
Italy.
uh, Italy. Italy. So, okay, let me put up the corrected version. How's that?
Abade in Pennsylvania for 20 year afore afflicted to Italy. That's
Ab-
if that's something I would say if it happened to be true, which it isn't. But that's
Okay.
something other. Yeah, but yes, that's something I would say.
All right, let me give it a shot. I bathed in Pennsylvania for 20 years before I flitted to Italy.
Well,
Now,
it's
as I
nae
hear
bad.
myself, it sounds terrible. I sound terrible.
That's nae bad for a first shorty.
My first time trying to speak Scots.
Yeah.
Um, oh, it's fun.
Mm,
And yeah, so that's
mm,
the exactly the kind of thing I'd love to see more Scottish
mm,
speakers be willing to do to work with
mm,
non-Scots interested in the language and the culture and
mm,
the literature. Because something I deal with Latin and ancient Greek is wanting to recapture at least some of the ancient sound, depending on the time period, of course, in order to appreciate the poetry and
mm.
the literature. You know, how did Cicero really sound in the Senate House when he was taking down Catalina?
It would be
Um,
nice. It would be nice to know, wouldn't it?
well,
Mm.
and we don't, yeah, and of course, we don't have 100% accuracy, but we're really close. You know,
No, no.
um,
I expect you moved on from the church Latin pronunciation.
which, yeah, the ecclesiastical or church pronunciation of Latin, I don't
Yeah.
usually use myself, but I can recite in it and speak in it slower than I can
Mm,
speak in the classical pronunciation of Latin, which is what I'm
yeah.
used to more. But all the pronunciations of Latin all have that certainly have their value, and you can appreciate the literature and any of them. But
Mm,
yeah, that part about especially the poetry, because the poetry and
mm,
the nature of it, you know, even simple things like word stress, which is something that interests me in Shakespearean original pronunciation, for example. The way that that language sounds is like certain places where there are stresses. They're just different from where they are in pretty much every other. It's certainly in RP or General American, and so it's valuable to learn those pronunciation differences. And thus, for me, like if I pick up, Robbie Byrne and I try to recite some of it, then
mm,
it's not quite the same as a native speaker could do, or someone who's really well acquainted with the language. So that's why I think it's so valuable. It's not just, this is not necessarily a language to go to be able to converse with someone in the store in Aberdeen, even though that would be a great future. I think that would be great if that were the case. If
mm,
someone was that comfortable with Scots
yeah.
speaking with a foreigner, um, but yeah, and I think a lot of people out there might be able to. Oh, look, I think there's a speaking of Finnish,
Hmm.
there's a Finnish person has left this. I think he's Finnish,
Uh,
based on his name. He says,
uh,
"I expect that Flitton comes from frutet, a similar word
mhm,
from Old Norse, in Scotland and Northern England, and you can say ta for thanks, which comes from Danish tak. That's
mm,
cool.
yep.
Yeah, his name looks Finnish, doesn't it? You know some Finnish, right?
Yes, Sumka is dull, dreary. It's the kind of weather we've got outside right now. And man is the genitive case of ma, which means land or country.
Hmm. The Drury land,
Yeah,
Drury of the land. Like,
the maybe the person concerned can explain the thinking behind it, but that's a literal reading of it anyway.
hmm. Yeah. Well, and let's go off topic a little bit because I wanted to
Yeah.
because you're like me, your initial education or career wasn't in language, but now you're super interested in language. How
Mm.
did that come about?
Oh, it was a gradual thing. I consider that my natural flair the whole time has been for languages, but my degree subject was in electronic engineering, which
Mm.
didn't come particularly naturally to me, but I worked hard. I got the degree. The interest in languages was something that developed after that, and I learned to speak French and I learned to speak Finnish. I'd studied French at school. That was a compulsory subject, but the real interest started. Although I can mention this because in both cases it was a long time ago. They both started from relationships. I used to be in one in London and one in Glasgow.
Mm.
But my wife, as I mentioned earlier, my wife is from she's Fairbrooch. She's from Fraserburgh.
Mhm.
Uh,
Fantastic. Well, that's fantastic. Yeah, and, wow, and what have you done with software engineering, if I may ask?
I've written a lot of software. I've worked for some better known companies, some lesser known companies. I
Mm.
have among the big companies. I've worked for ITT.
Mhm.
I've worked for British Telecommunications.
Mm.
Uh, but right now, I work for a company that specializes in engineering consultancy. It provides commissioning and hired commissioning engineers to oversee the completion and commissioning stages. That is the final stages of engineering projects.
Hmm.
And in their work, they use a software tool called Orbit, which supports their activities. And we also sell the software product separately for people who just want that rather than the human resource.
Hmm.
Have I answered the question?
Absolutely, you have.
Yeah,
You know, the people will be, curious about you,
yeah,
so, uh,
yeah.
and
What? Yeah. One thing about British Telecommunications, it's not a new feature, but uh, at one time people had to have answering machines, and then in the 90s they started a service in which that functionality was built into the telephone network. That is, if the call went unanswered, it was answered by a system that at the telephone exchange that did a similar job to the answering machine.
Hmm,
Well, I was
interesting.
one of the team who created that.
Wow,
Mm,
interesting, and I
mm.
suppose that's, the precursor to what we all have now in our modern devices, which I would assume they don't store the recorded message locally anymore, but in a cloud that can be accessed, from
I,
from a
I,
from a network.
I, I assume so. I left BT in 2000, so I haven't kept in touch with developments. But at the time, it was based on a disk-based store at the telephone
Mm,
exchange. What they do now, I don't know.
mm.
But that's probably the most publicly visible thing I ever worked on as a software developer.
Mm. Well, I actually just noticed we have some interesting questions here. And by the way, anyone out there, if I missed your question, feel free to ask it again or your comment again, and I'll
Yeah.
try to get it here. But someone asked this. So, is there a Norse substratum in Scots? Much of Scotland was conquered by the Vikings. And
I don't
I know,
know if that's
yeah, go ahead.
true. There is a certain amount of vocabulary. Uh, I think the exception to that would be in Shetland,
Hmm.
where a North Germanic variety was in current use
Hmm.
until I believe the 18th century, and the Scots that replaced it was took its place on top of a Norse substratum. And
Yeah.
if people claim, and some people do, that Shetlandic is actually a different language from Scots, then I won't go out of my way to disagree with that. I have heard recordings of Shetland speakers. One of those programs on my YouTube channel, Billy Kay's first program, starts with some women from the island of Falsey in Shetland, and
Mm.
I have great difficulty understanding what they're saying, and even after repeated listening, I don't understand all of it. So
Mm.
uh,
Yeah.
I don't think there's a Norse substratum in general Scots, but there is in the variety spoken in Shetland. I think
Yeah.
that is the situation as I understand it.
And for the same for me, I mean, I've just done a bit of the research secondhand, but no, I concur that Shetlandish. I'm sorry, I don't
Shet,
even remember.
Shetlandic.
There you go. Thank you. I don't know the proper name of it. The language of Shetland has, yes, is much more Norse influenced. Though there are many interesting theories about how the Middle English came about, which is of course the common origin to Scots and English. And there's a lot of studies which show that was much more influence from the Norse language when from the Danelaw than was previously estimated to explain some of the things that happened in Middle English, the loss of case systems and so forth. Previously, this was um, uh, attributed to the influence of Norman French on English, but apparently that was somewhat secondary and afterwards. So, in the sense that, of course, Scots and English are derived from a common event which involved the Norse, they certainly have that bit, but I don't think it's particularly more distinct in Scots, maybe just some different ways. And someone asked, Levi Way asked, did Scots have any influence from Cumbric?
I don't know for certain. I think the only influence that I know of would be in place names. You know, there are place names in Scotland which are from Brittonic. I don't know if they're specifically from Cumbric.
Yeah, I don't.
In Roman times, a Brythonic, I don't know which is the correct pronunciation, but it was spoken in Scotland as far as central Scotland as we know it today. Now, I don't know if the distinction between Cumbric and other Brittonic varieties existed at that period, but certainly there are place names in Scotland that are clearly Brittonic in origin. Whether there is any influence on the vocabulary or grammar of the current language, I don't know, but I don't think so.
And answering our question about the similarity between, say, Portuguese and Spanish, Andre Cuervo says that as a speaker of both Portuguese and Spanish, I find that analogy kind of accurate. Maybe it would be more like Galician and Portuguese, which are even more closely related languages. Yeah, I mean, it's
Yes.
hard to quantify. These are always just analogies, and languages are so wonderfully unscientific in the way that other things like matter and chemistry and physics can be quite clear, but whereas languages, it's a moving target, like based on what, in my video
Yes.
about dialect versus language, what defines something as a dialect or language isn't so clear cut, though I very fully endorse the importance of calling Scots a language, because that's very important to for pedagogical reasons. For just if we call it a language, then it becomes something worth learning. And it's hard to deny. It's like saying Portuguese and Spanish are the same language, which I think that's saying that is as valid as saying that Scots and English are the same, which they're not. So anyway, that's how I see it, despite there being pretty close. I was wondering, have you ever spoken your variety of Scots, being Doric, somewhere else in Scotland, and then there was some response to that?
Yes, you might remember me saying that I lived in Glasgow through the 1990s, and there really I only used Scots with other people that I knew were comfortable with it. And I've been back there since, because Fiona has relations in that area, and we even know a couple that we've made friends with purely through Facebook, and we use our Scots with them. But you could say that's by prior arrangement. If you just come out with it in front of someone you don't know and who's probably never heard it before, the reaction can be unpredictable. And there's a story I remember where I was heading for the Glasgow subway with someone I knew socially, and we were going home from a Scots language event we'd both been at. and we needed to get tickets for the subway, and I decided to buy them because, to cut a long story short, the companion I was with was actually quite a poor person. So I went up to the ticket booth and I said to the assistant behind the window, "Can I have 2 tickets, please?" And she looked at me and said, I can't do the Glasgow accent. I won't try. There's no need. She said, "Are you Faye Dundee?" Which, of course, I'm not. But she'd heard something unfamiliar. And rather than just selling me the tickets, she wanted to know where I was from. And there's no harm in that, really. But it just shows that if you just come out with it suddenly, people don't always know how to take it. So
Yeah.
that was Glasgow.
Yeah. Well, wonder, and these may not have easy answers, but
Mm.
um, I would I would ask you and all speakers of Scots, what do we do to what can we do to, as, and obviously this is not just people in Scotland, because this is a small but global
Mm.
community of people here who are watching. Um, what can we do to promote this language? What do you think we can do?
For my part, I think it would be very helpful if we had some use of Scots on Radio Scotland. Now there's a separate channel in Scottish Gaelic, Gaelic. But before that, they used to have specific programs at specific times of day in that language. And I don't think it would do any harm if they could have 10 minutes of the day's news, even 5 minutes of the day's news in Scots on Radio Scotland. And I think that would do a lot to boost it's not visibility, audibility, and respectability of the language in the public consciousness.
Hmm.
And it's not so bad in the northeast. People in the northeast here where I am, they often refer to Scots as Doric, which is I don't feel is a very good name for it for a couple of reasons. But at least people have a name for it other than slang, whereas in some parts of Scotland, people don't really understand the distinction between Scots and slang. And
Hmm.
I think having it in a publicly audible situation in broadcasting would do a lot to improve that.
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, I
But
strongly agree.
yeah, but if any of your viewers have thoughts on that, I would be interested to know them.
Absolutely. And we might even have people with connections too to
Mm,
a formal institution like the BBC. And for now, those media outlets like the BBC and so forth
mm,
have a lot of they have a lot of listeners, and they have a lot of viewers. But what I've found is that the what's so nice about the internet today is just how much influence people can have in this more grassroots way. I think there's a lot that we can do too through the creation of more YouTube channels and podcasts and things. Like there was one podcast which was associated with the Scots Language Center, and I think they stopped. This has been a crazy year for everyone.
mm.
But I noticed that much of it was intermixed. There was a lot of code switching with standard Scottish English, and I
Right.
found that I wasn't really annoyed because I love the sound of standard Scottish English
Mm,
too. Um,
mm.
but if I want to learn Scots, I need to hear, which is why I was so glad to have the CD that goes with your book, because I'm like, okay, I know this is 100% pure, authentic, and I think for the most part natively spoken Scots.
Yeah, yeah.
But entirely,
It's certainly intended to be. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Did you gather all the speakers yourself?
No, I didn't. In fact, I had the situation goes back to my time in Glasgow, although that's not where the speakers are from. But through Scots language circles, I knew a lady called Wendy de Russet who, after a couple of years, moved back to Buckie, which is a town in the northeast of Scotland. It was where her forebears had originally been from, and she moved back to live there. And the people who took part in the recordings are mainly people that I made contact with through Wendy de Russet.
Hmm. Oh,
And
fabulous.
Yes, and even better, the people who play the main characters, as well as being active everyday speakers, also had experience of taking part in amateur drama,
Ah, good.
which made them ideal, or as good as you could get for acting roles like the main characters and the dialogues.
Mm.
Uh,
And you're
I
both
did.
on there a couple of times, right?
What's that? Oh, I'm
You're
in there
on there.
as minor characters. Like I think I turn up. I can't remember. I think I turn up as a policeman and just a casual dialogue between two friends. But I
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah, the car was on the wrong side of the road. Yeah.
That's the one. Yes, that's the one. Yeah, yes. I think that was me. But the main characters were played by people with who were not only active speakers but had a background in amateur drama, and I made contact with them through Wendy DeRussit, who herself has since died. Which
Mm.
I don't know what I would do if I had to do it all again. I think there'd be the work would be harder if I had to do it all again.
Well, you've set this, foundation with, your book, with this chat.
Mm,
I think
yeah.
we're setting the foundation for,
Well, I hope you're right.
further Scots speakers, because I know the desire and the interest
Right.
must be out there
Mm,
in significant numbers. It's just maybe enough, Scots speakers just need to hear, "Hey, people out here in the world would love to appreciate your culture and language and
mm,
the way you think and feel in your own
mm,
native tongue to a great extent. And we need the coaching, just like we'd want to learn any language with a
mm.
rich cultural history,
That's right.
because otherwise, and that's the nice thing a little bit, I think, about there being a single universal language, because it means languages like in the past few decades, Italian is getting more and more popularity by people. And the reason is that everybody learns English. And once they do that, they don't need to choose between German or French as much anymore, as much as I love German and French or Spanish, for example, because they don't necessarily require that as critically as it was a few decades ago, which means that languages which don't have as much international importance, obviously, like say Spanish or French, um, like Italian. Now people are learning Italian. And why? Because they love the language and the culture and they want to visit there. And why not that for people who would like to connect more deeply with Scotland? And of course, this is not to put aside Gaelic at all. I know very little about Gaelic. I've studied a little bit of Irish and I've loved them too. I don't have as much experience with them. So anyone out there who knows Gaelic or likes Gaelic, I also very much promote that as well. Scots, I've gotten the feeling, has just been kind of not forgotten, but not as noticed, because it's not as um, distinct as Gaelic is, because Gaelic is so completely incomprehensible
Mm,
to someone who merely knows English, for example.
yeah.
So, yeah, that's my intention, is to see more Scots speakers like yourself
No,
uh,
thank you.
to do these things. So, yeah, I think you set the foundation with your book, and you're saying that calling it the Doric isn't a good name. Do you mean just for Northeast variety, or for the just calling? Because to call the whole language and it's all of its dialects, the Doric is an archaism now. It's not really correct anymore, right?
That's approximately the situation. Doric was originally a name given to Scots in the 18th century, and it was the name given to Scots of any variety. But it was a name given by the social classes who had rejected it, which
Mm,
I think is it originated as an exonym, and I think that's a reason not to use it. The other reason is that, of course, it's as you will know yourself, it's a misappropriated name. It really belongs to Greece.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's another reason not to use it. But something that you said was right. Originally, it was a name for Scots of any variety. More recently, it's come to be a name given to the variety spoken in northeast Scotland.
I
I
wonder why that
either possibly because it's more conservative and has kept more closely to uh, the historic language as opposed to what you might consider to be the more eroded varieties spoken elsewhere in the country.
is.
Uh,
Yeah.
Even there, although it's certainly not a new name, but you might say its coverage has been patchy. And when I was a child in the 1960s, my grandparents and their generation, if they didn't call it Scots, they called it Scotch.
Right.
Uh, and I didn't hear the name Doric in that sense until the 1970s. And initially, I didn't know what it was referring to. And interestingly enough, it was by a person who had personally rejected the language.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Interesting.
so it's
Yeah.
nothing. But the good thing about Doric is that people know what you mean by it. If I say if I say whenever Fiona and I are at home just talking to another, we always speak in the Doric, and people know what that means.
Right.
Uh, yeah.
In the
So
vernacular.
yeah, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Right. And in the vernacular of these of the Northeast
In the
and
vernacular of the Northeast, exactly.
Aberdeen. Well, yeah, I it's interesting too, and I'm glad to hear that too. As a non-native of Scotland, I when I hear it and knowing what I know about ancient Greece and all the beautiful poems and literature that's written in
Mm,
Doric Greek, um, which obviously is not the dominant version of Greek, which
mm,
the Attic and the Koine, which comes out of it, which is based on Attic and it's almost identical to it, um, is uh, is obviously the prestige language. But there's so many wonderful things in it, and the fact that the Spartans themselves the who were famous for their laconic sayings and for their and for other things that have survived in literature. Uh, as an outsider, knowing what I know about Greece, I think it's a great term. But I'm glad to hear too that it's not a term that since it originally is used by people, I guess you said in the 17th or 18th century.
I believe so. Yes,
Yeah,
that
the
was
rice
how
poet.
the name originated. It was
It's
they,
funny,
they they knew what it originally meant, but they diverted it as a name for Scots.
right?
Uh,
And
uh, but these were people who personally had rejected it,
that's fine, and
possibly.
it's that seems ignorant too because despite the prestige of Attic or Athenian Greek, Doric is so important part of the literature, and rejecting it would be to reject a huge part of the corpus. And I can't imagine
Mm,
any ancient Greek student or teacher saying,
yeah,
"Don't learn anything about Doric."
mm,
That would
mm,
um, seem unlikely because you have to get a broad sense of dialects to
yeah.
master ancient Greek. And I had a question from Kieran Piers. What does Colin think of the swath of contemporary in Scots children's books? For example, Room on the Broom and some Roald Dahl stuff.
I don't know how well I can comment on that because I haven't really read them to any great extent. Uh, they would be more valuable if they were written in a generic written Scots that is
Mm,
not associated with any pronunciation. But I think to be to motivate people to read a work of any length, it has to be written in a way that they find familiar,
mm,
that they've seen before. And we have a problem with most Scots writing, which is that it isn't necessarily written in a way that people are familiar with that they've seen before,
mm,
because it's written in whatever way the writer or the translator decided was most suitable.
hmm,
Uh, I've heard people reading those books aloud, and they sound all right to me in terms of stories told in Scots that you could read aloud, and the Scots sounds perfectly all right to me. But as written work, I think they're hindered by the fact that we haven't adopted a generic written orthography that anyone can be familiar with.
Do you think the orthography on the scotslanguage.com is highly variable?
I would need to look more closely at it. To be honest, it's
Yeah.
sometimes since I looked at it.
And
Yeah,
I very much agree with you,
mm,
because, for example, we were talking earlier, today about, European Portuguese versus Brazilian Portuguese, and I got out my little, reader here of Portuguese, and, I
yeah,
read a little bit, and I'm I chose to use a Brazilian pronunciation, so I chose a pronunciation. I think that's probably a good model. We have obviously Standard English has more than one um, pole of or center of pronunciation. RP and General American are the two most influential, I would probably say, in the world, right? And Portuguese, you have a Lisbon way of pronouncing things, and then Brazilian varieties as well. And so we can do that, but the way it's spelled is almost identical. And there's going to be some small changes, like in the UK, you spell color with a U, but almost identical. And that's really, I think it is really important to have that too for extensive reading, because
Mm.
if we have extensive reading, high intelligibility, written text that we can read, such as some of the websites that we're looking at today and other articles, then we don't have to struggle. If we're constantly struggling to learn a new orthography for the same language, we're going to be held back. We're going to be slowed down by how much we can learn as foreign speakers. So that is, yeah, it's a kind of, as you're saying, a spelling which works for any pronunciation. Have you? Oh, that's what I want to ask. After the publishing of Luath Scots 20 years ago, did you find that any Scottish people were uh, annoyed by any of the spelling conventions you used as far as comprehensibility goes?
Not that I heard of. The only objection that I really heard, well, there was an there was an ignorant reviewer in, I can't remember where it was. I think it might have been the Times. An ignorant reviewer who shall remain nameless, except that it was Michael Fry, who said that Wilson finds himself teaching a language that no one really speaks.
Hmm.
Because I
Really?
hadn't written it in dialect. But
Really?
that's
I don't
yeah,
understand. But the text, the dialogues that you wrote weren't how people actually speak, is what you said? What the person said?
well, that's what he claimed. Uh,
But, I mean, you know that not to be true because you wrote them and you speak that way, right?
yes, I know that not to be true, and in fact, I put that comment to some local people from around the area where we recorded the dialogues, that is around Bucky, and they were as mystified as I was. But when you're writing for the Times, you can say what you want and get away with it for the
Uh,
most part.
that's a
Yeah,
shame. Well, that's
yeah,
what I'm thrilled by our new kinds of media, like YouTube,
yeah.
obviously, is very powerful.
Mm.
Because I like to think of this as a beginning, and hopefully we're inspiring, especially a lot of Scottish speakers
Mhm.
out there today to
Yeah,
make more content. I mean, look,
mm,
we have just for the example,
yeah,
you wrote a wonderful book 20 years ago. We get to have this conversation today. Just one wonderful piece of content, two if you include the CD, and think of how much more could be created in such a short time by people. And then, yeah, for me, my opinion is that the more that there are foreign people trying to learn
mm,
the language, and the more that we get guided properly, like correct Scots. I don't want to write in Scots. Um, that's not according to some recognizable spelling. I don't want to make it up phonetically based on what I'm hearing. I don't want to try to speak merely in a Scottish accent as if I'm just an actor doing an impression or something. I want to really speak the language in a way which is certainly, well, I'll have a foreign accent as I have in every foreign language I speak. Um, but what's I think is fantastic is that we will see lots of other people wanting this. So, Scottish people out there who are interested, if you find people like me, of which I know there are quite a few, who are polyglots, we're very serious about learning a language. We want to learn it correctly. We want to learn it to the maximum extent that we are capable of doing. Even if we're just dabblers, we want to take it, very, very seriously. And yeah, so we'll need help. We'll need a lot of help to do it, especially because we need more content. So
yeah.
that's what I wanted to say about it. If anyone out there has any other questions for
Uh,
Colin today,
but
oh,
before
go
that,
ahead,
I'd just like to offer a comment on what
please.
you just said,
Yeah,
which is that as you rightly pointed out, the book is 20 years old, and I look at it and I think, well, it isn't a bad bit of work for something produced by an amateur working in his spare time. But it
it's
was a long
fantastic.
time. It was a long time ago. If more recently, that is now, some academic linguists were to put in the work full time to produce something better, if they did that, no one would be more pleased than I would be.
Yeah, and one a person I can think of, Dr. Michael Dempster, who also has a YouTube
Yeah.
channel where he discusses and teaches entirely in very comprehensible Scots.
Mm,
Hopefully, he gets to see this too at some point and to make more content. I mean, we just need content. We need a lot
mm, yeah.
of comprehensible input. If the standardization of spelling would be it doesn't have to be exactly the same. We get along fine. People in Canada, for example, use a mix of General American and RP typical spellings, and they're fine. It's fine to have some variety, but generally aiming towards some kind of um, consistency would be very helpful for foreign speakers. And
I've
go ahead.
I've met Michael Dempster, and
Have
I've
you?
seen some of his things. Yes, just once, a couple of years ago, and I have seen some of the things he's done on the web, and they're good. And if that could serve as the basis for another full-length language course, better than the one I did, because he is a professional after all. But it wouldn't necessarily have to be him or only him. Really, if someone could, I would be very pleased.
You're very humble, sir, and no, without need, but it's
Oh,
yeah. I mean, it's what's so gratifying to me. Although I don't
mm,
like, I would love to have a command of basic conversation,
mm,
and hopefully I can, repeating, of course, the material that you've already produced, eventually get to the point where I can confidently at least say some things
mm,
in the language and without feeling like I'm doing too many things
mhm.
incorrectly. But besides that, I can now almost any text I pick up that's in Scots, I can understand it. I can
Oh, that's
people are
great. That's great.
people write on Twitter and
Mhm,
on Facebook. They write to each other in Scots, and now I can understand the written language, even if it's not in a standard spelling. I get it. I can follow it, and which is great because it's
mm.
why um well, why should it be just something that yeah, that isn't taught, I suppose, is what I had to say. So yeah, it's fantastic. I'm really happy with what I've been able to learn so far, but there's so much
Very
more,
pleased.
and I would love to be able
Very
to learn
pleased.
too.
Very
Yeah,
pleased.
yeah, me too. And let's see if anyone else has a question here. Let's see. I don't see any others. Well, here's one that says, "What is your opinion on books written in Scots? I've encountered others writers who write in the dialect. And I think by dialect he might mean Scots itself
Mm,
as a language, if not one of the
mm.
dialects of Scots."
Difficult question to answer, because it's difficult to have a single opinion about such a wide-ranging topic. Books written in Scots. Uh, they vary. Some are good, some aren't so good. I don't know how I can put it better than that. It's a very wide-ranging question, and I think the answer has to be wide-ranging to it. Some are better and some aren't so good.
Mm, right. Oh, and he said that he does mean Scots. Thank you
Yeah,
for
yes,
clarifying.
yes,
Yeah, and
yes.
which is and I don't mean to, and a non
Mm,
user, I don't mean to correct you either. You're welcome to, if
mm,
I'm not from Scotland, you're welcome to call vernacular language dialect if you wish. My personal motivation, my political motivation, if you will, is to call it a language to
mm,
promote its being taught in
mm,
Scotland and its usage, for example, Radio BBC Scotland, as well as for foreigners to be able to acquire the language as well. So
mm.
yeah, go ahead,
Yes.
Colin.
I'll add something to that, which is that
Please.
of the written Scots that I have seen, uh, the the best in my view has actually come from writers who wrote in a particular regional dialect. In fact, in the same regional dialect that I use myself. Now, I don't know whether there's a cause and effect relationship between that, but certainly, for example, the poems by Flora Gary, I would say that that is the best written Scots that I know. But
Could you say it
she
again? I'll write it down.
Flora Gary,
How is Gary spelled?
Garry.
Okay, that's what I thought. I wanted to make
Yeah,
sure. Very
yeah.
good.
But she wrote in Northeast Scots. You know, if you look at the way she spells words, they're intended to represent the Northeast pronunciation.
Hmm.
But of course, this was someone. Well, yes, a book in Scots that I did enjoy. Her poems. It's called Benny Goke and Other Poems.
Benny Gok?
Benny Goke. I'll spell that for you. It's not a. It's a place name. So there's a poem in the book about this place called Bennygoak. That's spelt Bennygoak.
Two words?
One word.
Got it. All right, I'll
Yeah,
put it here on the screen for people to find.
yeah.
Thank you, Colin.
A-
That's
And
very, very helpful.
and her writing is authentic. She did actually speak the language in which she wrote. She was raised on a farm, and not all writing in Scots is by people who use it habitually. Uh, but she did.
That's good. Yeah, and
Yeah,
in fact,
yeah.
you mean
Bennygoak and Other Poems.
Benny Gok and Other Poems is what
And
it's
Other
called.
Poems,
Okay,
yeah,
I'll
yeah.
definitely
That
look
that
into that.
that that is my favorite book in Scots.
Alright.
And another good one is completely different. It's a novel written around the turn of the century, this recent century. I mean, by Matthew Fitt, and it's called The Butt and Ben a Go-Go, and it's a futuristic novel written entirely in Scots. And in fact, I believe Matthew Fitt is one of the translators behind the Roald Dahl books that someone else mentioned.
Is it Fitz or Fit?
Fitt, F-I-T-T, Matthew
Alright,
Fitt.
I've
Uh,
attempted to spell it. I don't
Matthew Fitt, the butt. That's almost right, except that it's Ben rather than Bin. That's probably my accent
oh,
showing.
no,
The butt,
no,
no, the butt and Ben a go-go.
you're not allowed to have an accent that shows if you're saying Scots and you're a native Scots speaker, so
Yeah,
it's not so and Ben, right? Uh,
B-E-N. Are you familiar with the term butt and Ben?
I'm not, no, what does that mean?
Okay, it's a. You probably still get them. It's the name for a type of rural dwelling, which had two rooms, and you entered through the door into one room, and then that was the outer room,
Mhm.
and there was then another door into the inner room.
Mm.
Uh, so it's a country cottage, but the two rooms are but the house and ben the house.
Ah,
You
okay.
okay? Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with. If have you ever passed through Amsterdam Airport, Schiphol Airport?
I have actually.
Yes, and you will see signs in Dutch saying buitenlandvluchten and binnenlandvluchten. Well,
Huh,
it's the same two words, external and internal.
wow.
And that's
That's
the
wow.
and Ben is the room for a particular type of country cottage where
Hmm.
you've got this juxtaposed with a go-go, which I think is there not an establishment in Hollywood called the Whiskey a Go-Go?
Hmm.
Or there was at one time.
Really? That's
Yeah.
uh, we have one more, question for you, Colin.
Mm, yeah.
Would it be reasonable to call Scots, English dialects of Middle English, but,
Oh, well,
languages, in their
oh,
own rights?
well, it probably is, but I think to get a better answer for a question like that, that's a question you would need to put to an academic linguist who's well versed in the history of these forms of language and their development, which I have to admit I'm not. I'm simply a speaker who wanted to share the language as it is now with other people, and I did go into some explanation of how we got to where we are, but it isn't my explanation isn't definitive by any means. And if you want to know about that thing, there are probably other books, historical linguistic books, you could get that kind of answer from, certainly better than I can provide them. I'm sorry
Sure.
about that. That's
No,
just how
don't
it is.
apologize. It's fantastic. You're too humble, sir, but thank you so
Mm,
much.
mm.
I could keep talking to you all day, but I don't wanna keep you any longer. Doing live streams is super fun,
It
but of
is.
course
I've
it's
just noticed we have been here an hour and a half.
that's
It
right.
didn't. it didn't seem like it, but yes, an hour and a half. That's probably long enough, unless there's anyone else with any pressing questions to answer before we
Mm.
draw to a close.
And what I'll say too, those of you who have asked questions, or if you have one you haven't asked yet, write them in the comments after the video goes public, and then I or Colin will get back to you.
Do
I
our
wanted to
best
ask.
anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I will. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll let you know if I see one that I can't answer. What I wanted to ask, Colin, before we go, can you maybe is there a phrase you could teach all of us that's a nice Scots expression of any type, any variety, anything that occurs to you?
Oh dear me. Any type that occurs to me.
Yeah, either a
Uh,
salutation, a greeting, a goodbye, anything that's
okay, well, I'll just
yeah.
before I close, I'll just say it's been rare. I haven't seen only a you bar look here, although you've been seeing me, but it's been rare to be here. It's been rare joining in with this. I didn't think the time would flee anything like as quick as it's done, but that's just the way it has been rare, and I hope, or like if no, I was I, I was going to want to say if you've enjoyed it half as much as I have, I've enjoyed it twice as much as you.
Well, thank you so much, Colin.
I shouldn't collect like that. It's a bit of course.
I look forward to talking with you more about how we can promote
Uh,
the Scots
mm,
language domestically
mm.
and abroad. And all of you out there, if you have an interest in the Scots language, I can strongly recommend Luath Scots Language Learner by Colin Wilson, who's here with us today. Links in the description. And
Joking aside, it's been rare to be with you. Thank you all for being here to listen to us. And what can I say? But thank you,
and thank you,
Muckles.
thank you, Muckles. Thank you very much. And we'll end there. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, Abdi.